Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at how well Israeli top tier does in 2025. Now, for anybody who hasn't seen the previous installments in the series, essentially what I do with this series is I take a top tier lineup, I play it for 10 games, I give you the unfiltered stats for those 10 games, and then I do some reflections on where I think the lineups are at, and specifically the vehicles that have changed since the last time I have looked at a nation's top tier lineup. With this Israeli lineup, I ended up with a 40% win rate, 32 kills, and 16 deaths. This actually ended up with a fairly low win rate in terms of the overall average I've had for this series. However, the 2 KD was actually pretty strong. One thing I will note is that the team seemed anomalously bad, and it didn't seem to matter what nations I was paired with or against. In fact, I almost never had another Israeli player with me, so I don't think it was Israel specifically. I think I just had a run of bad luck. Obviously, with a small sample size of 10 games, that kind of stuff is bound to happen. One game it actually dropped me in late and my team was down 3 players, so I suspect there might have been some major connection issues at the start of that match, but it's whatever. Anyway, I think the win rate was a bit of an anomaly, but the 2 KD definitely gives you an impression of how well I did in the various vehicles. Now, before we get into the vehicles themselves, one thing I do want to briefly touch on is the trophy system, the active protection system that's currently on 2 Israeli top tier vehicles. And the trophy system, in my experience, is wildly inconsistent. Sometimes it will save you from shots that would normally kill you. Sometimes you will get hit by missiles that the trophy system should have hit from a mile away, and those missiles will instantly kill you. The system just seems wildly inconsistent, and that's kind of my biggest problem with it. Sometimes it does work incredibly well, sometimes it basically seems like it's not even there. And we're starting off with the MBT category, and while there haven't been any changes to it yet, there is one coming in the next patch that's going to add some additional modules to the vehicle. However, I'm going to be honest, I don't feel it will affect the performance of the Merkava series on the whole, and I do feel it's important to reflect on where the Merkava series is currently at. The last review, I actually felt the Merkavas were quite good with a 5-second reload, and I do want to give an update on that. The Merkavas played incredibly well. In fact, outside of the Leopard 2A7V, it was one of the better tanks I've played for this series so far. And there are a lot of different factors that go into it. I think one of the big ones is that while a lot of people will critique the Merkava's raw armor thickness, the Merkava has the weirdest damage model out of any tank at top tier, and this led to a lot of scenarios where I would survive hits and basically be fine and still able to return fire, whereas I would guess in any other MBT I probably would be dead. And a lot of this comes down to things like muscle memory. If you get that reflex for where to snap your gun to something like a Leopard or an Abrams or a T-Series, which a lot of people will, because by the time you get all the way to top tier, you would have had to fight with or against a lot of these vehicles at this point, then you can easily snap to them at basically any angle or any distance. You have that reflex that you need to shoot at them precisely. Whereas if you have something like a Merkava, like I said, I didn't have a lot of Israeli players on my team, and even when I was playing a lot of the other nations for this series, I rarely saw the Merkava 4s. So a lot of players don't have that muscle memory to know exactly where to shoot it at a given angle, and this might not seem that bad because the raw armor thickness isn't that high. However, the turret has a lot of giant chunks of armor where you can easily hit them and do no damage if you catch them at the right angle. And additionally, I cover this when I was looking at the Merkava 4s in a lot of previous videos, the upper sides of the tank has a remarkably thick piece of composite armor that can stop basically every autocannon even at a flat angle. Even something like a 2S38 will really struggle to do damage through this one strip of armor on the upper side of the hull, and this also can even stop tank rounds if it's thickly angled. This leads to a lot of non-pens or shots that get caught on things like engines or non-critical components where the Merkava is still able to return fire where another tank would have been completely destroyed. And this is one of those things where I've always said this about the Merkavas, they're never completely safe. You don't have the raw armor thickness to ever be safe, but they always have at least a small chance that the round doesn't hit the serious components that the enemy needs to completely disable you, so while they're never completely safe, they always have a chance of surviving. On top of that, one of the features that I think is seriously underrated with the Merkavas, and it feels so good to play them once you get used to this, is the 64 km/h reverse gear combined with the fact that the turret doesn't have any part of the vehicle that it has limited depression over. A lot of vehicles have humps on the back of the vehicle or over the sides where they don't get the full gun depression. And even the vehicles that don't have it, things like the Russian tanks that generally have better depression over the back of the vehicle, don't have good reverse gears. The Merkava has excellent reverse gears and excellent depression over all aspects of the vehicle, and it makes it feel very versatile even though it's not the fastest vehicle in the game. Obviously, when you couple that with a fairly competent APF SDS round, a 5-second reload, and a fairly bonkers high explosive round that I've covered on some previous videos on the Merkavas and the Israeli 120s in general, and you get a fairly capable, well-rounded tank. One underrated feature of the Merkava that you don't have on a lot of other top tier MBTs, a few of them do have it. Tanks like the Leclerc and the American Seps do have the option for it. And this is a heavy machine gun that is controlled by the gunner, not the commander. It's one of those weird features that once you get used to it, it actually is pretty handy in several scenarios because you always have your heavy machine gun available even if you're down to the bare minimum crew, whereas tanks that rely on roof-mounted machine guns are more likely to lose access to them. And this does lead to some situations where, especially against lighter vehicles, the HMG will still be able to take out a target, whereas if you were in another vehicle where it was controlled by the commander, you would be SOL. In that respect, I feel like the Merkava 4s are one of those vehicles where the raw stats are just not telling you the full story of how good the vehicle is. I feel it's a lot more capable than most people make it out to be, and in my opinion, it is still a very solid MBT. I don't think the new changes to its damage model will really alter its functionality that much, because while it can sometimes absorb hits, you weren't really relying on it anyway. It would just sometimes be a happy accident when it happened. Of course, going into the anti-air, and one of the big additions Israel got since the last time we saw them was the Spider. The Spider is an interesting anti-aircraft vehicle because it is a single vehicle system and it can't shoot while moving, which does increasingly put it at a disadvantage because the multi-vehicle systems you can move the radar and still fire one of the launchers, and then you have systems like the CSSA-5 that can shoot while moving, and the Tunguska as well. So increasingly a lot more anti-aircraft systems have some capacity to both move and shoot, whereas the Spider is still limited in that area. However, the Spider, despite being a very big vehicle, is still a single vehicle system, and the radar doesn't actually move, so poking it over buildings, it's not as likely to draw attention as something like an IRIS-T radar. So in that respect, while it is annoying to try and hide it in some scenarios, it's not as bad as something like a full-on IRIS-T system. As far as its missiles, I find the Pythons are probably the more reliable of the two if you get a target within range. However, anecdotally, shots out to about 20 kilometers with the Derbies did still occasionally land, so I find its missile salvos are adequate in most scenarios. They're not amazing, but the fact that you have both an active radar homing missile and an infrared missile does give you a little bit more versatility than vehicles that are limited to only one type or only the other type of missile. So at the end of the day, while the Spider, in my opinion, is not exactly the best anti-air, it is a fairly competent anti-air, and it is on the high end for a lot of the minor nation AAs in terms of its ability to just fill gaps that other AAs may otherwise have. It can shoot through things like LDRCMs, it can hit targets that are notching. In and of itself, this does open up some options that some of the other anti-airs don't necessarily have because they're limited to only infrared or only active radar homing missiles. And ultimately, Israel is a minor nation, so it's not like your team is going to be entirely reliant on the Spider for its sole air defense. But even if it is, the Spider is pretty competent against all but the best planes, so I still think it's a pretty solid vehicle all around. Now, the only light tank addition that Israel got was actually more of a side grade rather than an upgrade. So previously you had the Namur 30, now you have the Namur Shrikon. And the major differences between these two platforms are pretty minor. The hull, for the most part, is basically identical. I didn't really notice any differences, at least not any that practically affected the way you play them. However, the turret is where you start getting into some of the interesting differences. The Namur 30 has the missile launcher mounted in parallel with the main gun, and it elevates and rotates with the main gun. So what this means in practice is that even at fairly close ranges, the spikes can still work. Although they are spikes, they are still pretty inconsistent in general. The Namur Shrikon, however, has its spike missiles in basically the same configuration that you see on something like the CV90 Mark IV, where they're pointed at an upwards angle, which limits them to only about 150 meter plus engagement. Anything closer than 150 meters, the missiles are going to struggle to drop down on the target in time. So it is going to limit the Namur Shrikon on closer quarter maps. Additionally, one thing you'll notice with the Namur Recon is you don't get your full depression over the forward arc. You actually have to rotate it over the sides to get your full depression, which is a little janky, but ultimately it does have about the same depression over the sides as you can get on the Namur 30. So it can still use these kind of hold down positions pretty efficiently, and the Namur Recon does come with a trophy system, so the Namur Recon can be particularly good against other spike missile wielding IFVs when the trophy feels like working, because the Namur Recon has protection against their missiles, but a lot of them don't have protection against your missiles. So your spikes will knock out something like a Puma VJTF or a CV-90 Mark IV, whereas their spikes will often just get eaten by your trophy. This does mean the Namur Recon has a unique role in the Israeli lineup, and this is one thing I noticed that was different from how the IFVs and the Russian lineup worked, because while the Namurs aren't exactly great in terms of mobility, they do have that excellent hold down protection that makes them very annoying to get rid of, especially if they can get near a capture point so they can refill their ammo, because both of them at their core still have that same problem in that you'll often lose all of your ammo if anything hits your turret. But if you have a nice hold down position that's at least within short driving distance of something like a capture point, you can just go refill your ammo basically at leisure and you're pretty much good to go. It's going to be very annoying for any vehicle to try to kill you while you're hold down next to a capture point. So there were a few scenarios where I specifically took out the Namur Recon because there were hold down positions that I could take good advantage of that I didn't feel I could do quite as well in the Merkava 4s. So while these Namurs aren't exactly great, they do have some utility that the Merkava 4s don't necessarily equal. Now, in terms of overall helicopters, the Israeli helicopter, the AH-60, didn't actually change that much. However, the meta around it has kind of changed. Now, in addition to the normal threats, you have the brand new range of anti-air to contend with, and in addition to that, you also have LDIRCMs on some of the enemy helicopters, like the Z-10ME or the Mi-28NM. That being said, the AH-60 was pretty well insulated against a lot of these changes, as it does have a lot of fire and forget missiles, so even some of the higher end SAM systems can be stressed by it, and in addition to that, fire and forget missiles in general are much more favorable when you need to expose yourself for as little as possible. On top of that, the LDIRCMs can be defeated by the good old-fashioned high-velocity 20mm cannon, which the AH-60 has, but some helicopters like the Tiger UHT don't have. So overall, I think the AH-60 is in a pretty good spot. While it might get power crept a little, I think on the whole it is still slated to be one of the top 3 helicopters in the game for at least the next 6 months to a year, if not even a little longer. Of course, one area where we've seen a lot of changes is actually in terms of the fixed wing aviation for Israel, because not only have we had a new F-16 added and a new F-15 added, we also have a new F-16 coming in the next patch. And one big thing that all of these new vehicles have in common, and also now the Barak 2, the F-16D, also has is that they have infrared guided fire and forget missiles, finally. This is one area where Israel did struggle with for a while, because Israel really didn't have a lot of aircraft that had access to infrared missiles. Certainly you had things like the Kurnos 2000, but ever since the Kurnos 2000 lost its access to long-range air-to-air missiles, it became less useful in general, although it's still a competent-ish fighter if you don't want to go above 12.0. So a big thing to note is that for the F-16D and also the F-16C and the upcoming F-16I, one big feature is that all of them have the Spice bombs, which are fire and forget infrared guided bombs. Now they are slower than fire and forget infrared guided missiles. They have some of the weaknesses of Mavericks in that area, and that they can be a little bit too slow to reactively hit opponents. It's simply very easy for a munition this slow for the enemy to simply break line of sight or die before the munition ever gets there. However, getting access to a fire and forget option, especially when these are fairly large bombs that if they hit targets will certainly kill them in the vast majority of cases, is pretty nice. In addition, the F-16I, the ROM, does get access to Mavericks in addition to GPU guided bombs, and also just in general carries a ton of ordnance just like its cousin, the American F-15E. Now if you want the basic breakdown of these different aircraft, the main drawback of the F-16D is that it's stuck with derbies, whereas the F-16C does get access to the more powerful AIM-120s. Additionally, the F-16D is the heavier of the group, so it's not exactly the best in dogfighting. It's a little outdated at this point, but with spike bombs, derbies, and AIM-9Ms in addition to various types of JDAMs, it will certainly get the job done. It's just not exactly an impressive offering. The F-16C is certainly better in this area. The main drawback to the F-16I is that it's stuck with the AIM-120Cs, and the AIM-120Cs, for some reason, Gaijin is just made worse than the AIM-120Bs in most situations. So while it is stuck with the worst variant of the AMRAAM for some reason, the F-16I should should be pretty solid in general for the vast majority of your needs. However, if you do just want a brute that carries a metric ton of ordnance, the F-15I, the ROM, can carry up to 8 air-to-air missiles in addition to Mavericks and still has room left over for various GBUs. So the F-15 is certainly a bit of a brute force option, but it definitely gets the job done. Compared to how sparse the Israeli air options in terms of fixed-wing casts were the last time we looked at them, this is a pretty sizable upgrade. Now, none of these are really standouts. They don't have crazy powerful weapons. They don't have anything anywhere near as powerful as the KH-38MT. They don't have weapons as good as the Hammers, but they're still competent aircraft that can get the job done, and if you are good at flying casts at top tier, you can certainly get work done in basically all of them. So overall conclusions, where do I think Israel is at right now in terms of top tier? And honestly, I think Israel is in a pretty good spot. Getting access to a competent light tank that fills at least a somewhat unique role, even if it's not the traditional light tank role, does help them out. Getting access to a competent anti-air helps them out. In addition, having one of the best helicopters in the game and some pretty competent fixed wing casts now. Overall, there are very few areas where you can say Israel is lacking, and it does have a few pretty good options that do stand out. Like the Merkava 4s, in my opinion, are a really good MBT. They're very underrated. A lot of people focus and fixate on the armor thickness, and in my opinion and experience, the tank still performed perfectly fine even without it. On top of that, the AH-60 is still one of the stronger helicopters you can get. So in addition to having a competent lineup with very few glaring weaknesses other than not really having a fast ground vehicle right now, the lineup does work quite well for a minor nation lineup where you're not expected to carry the full weight of the matchmaker on you like you are with the major nations. On the whole, if they could find a way to add a nice fast light vehicle to complement things like the Namur, I'm not even sure if Israel has anything that fills that role, but if there is something out there that would fill that role, it would make Israel a lot better rounded and honestly one of the better minor nations that you can play. The MBTs were pretty versatile, the anti-air was pretty good, and you have a wide array of cast options for basically any taste you could possibly want, the light tank lineup only being the exception where I feel like it is a little lacking. So I definitely feel like Israel's in a much more solid state right now than it was when I first visited them back in the Israeli top tier review. But those are just my opinions on the matter. How do you find the Israeli top tier? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Let me know in the comments down below. I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, found it entertaining, educational, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.